Hi, string theory solved by history selection. The Born-Hilborn rule as the missing quantum gravity selector. Let us begin at the summit, because the summit is worth seeing before we climb. String theory does not fail because it has too many possible worlds. String theory fails or appears incomplete because it has no satisfying rule for selecting which possible world becomes reality. The Born-Hilborn interpretation supplies that rule. String theory gives the possible geometry. String theory gives the landscape. String theory gives the compactifications, vacua, extra dimensions, brains, boundary structure, black hole microstates, and candidate universes. Born-Hilborn selects the coherent history. That is the resolution. Reality is not merely particles moving through time. Reality is not merely strings vibrating in hidden dimensions. Reality is not merely a multiverse warehouse filled with every unchosen possibility, which is the cosmic equivalent of refusing to clean your garage and calling it elegance. Reality is history selection. In the simplest language, reality equals quantum possibility multiplied by space-time expectations. In the strongest language, the lived universe is the string theoretic history whose geometry, constants, records, observers, memories, and future boundary conditions cohere across a complete space-time block. That is the thesis. String theory is the possible engine. Born-Hilborn is the history selector. Quantum gravity is the place where possible spacetime becomes selected reality. Now we start at the beginning. String theory was never merely a theory of little vibrating strings. That is the children's book doorway, and it is useful. It says that what we call particles may be different vibrating modes of a more fundamental object. A string, one vibration appears as one particle. Another vibration appears as another particle. The electron, quark, photon, graviton, not separate billiard balls, but different music from the same underlying instrument. That image is beautiful, but string theory became much more than that. It became a possible framework for quantum gravity. It forced physicists to face extra dimensions, brains, branes, black holes, holography, duality, entropy, quantum information, and the possibility that spacetime itself is not fundamental in the naive way we imagine. Leonard Susskind helped push this story into its modern form. Black holes are not merely collapsed stars. They are laboratories for quantum gravity. Holography is not a decorative metaphor. It is a clue that the information describing a volume may be encoded on a lower dimensional boundary. ADS/CFT, born from Maldaceni's work, became the great mathematical bridge. Gravity in a higher dimensional bulk can correspond to a quantum field theory on lower dimensional boundary. That is not a small insight. That is the warning flare. Boundary information matters. Geometry may be encoded. Spacetime may be emergent. Spacetime is always in superposition. The world we experience may be more like a projected history than a pile of dead objects. Science is not materialism. Science is reducing paradox. Science is reducing paradox, not about claiming materialism. Science and materialism are not the same thing. Science is reducing paradox. Adapt or switch professions. Now, string theory faces a famous problem, the landscape. Instead of producing one obvious universe, string theory appears to allow an enormous number of possible vacua, different compactification, different ways of curling extra dimensions, different constants, different particle spectra, different low-energy laws, different possible worlds. The critic says, that is a disaster, too many possibilities. Born-Hilborn says, no, that is exactly what a history selection theory requires. A selector needs something to select from. That's the selector math. A menu is not a failure because it has many dishes. It is only a failure if nobody can explain why this dish was ordered. String theory gives the menu. Born-Hilborn gives the order. Reality is the meal actually served. That is why the landscape is not the embarrassment. The missing selector is the embarrassment. The ordinary question in string theory is, which vacuum is mathematically allowed? The Born-Hilborn question is better. Which complete history generated by a vacuum can become the coherent lived world? That shift solves the real problem. A vacuum is not selected as a naked geometry. A vacuum is selected by the history it can carry. Selected. A possible vacuum must support stable records, causal order, black hole information preservation, observers, memory, Markov blankets, consciousness, future expectations, and the internal experience of time. Time is explained by this equation. It must support a universe where facts can remain facts long enough for observers to remember them and build science from them. A vacuum that cannot support stable atoms is low weight. A vacuum that cannot support causality is low weight. A vacuum that cannot support memory is low weight. This is memory. History selection is memory. History selection makes mind and memory too big for brain body. A vacuum that cannot support observers is low weight. A vacuum that cannot support future compatible continuity is low weight. A vacuum that can support coherent records, observers, memory, stable geometry, and future boundary conditions receive greater Born-Hilborn weight. The string vacuum is selected by the history it can make coherent. That is the missing rule. So simplified. Imagine string theory is an enormous library. Every possible book is on the shelf. Universes with different laws, different dimensions, different constants, different histories. The old problem says, there are too many books. Born-Hilborn says, wrong problem. Who chooses the book? And the answer is not a man in sky with a library card handing you the book. The chooser is the whole space-time structure, past constraints, future expectations, observer boundaries, records, memory, and global coherence. Every locus of comparisons give global consistency. The selected book is the one whose story can be read from beginning to end without contradiction, without paradox. That is the reality. Now let us bring in history selection more directly. In ordinary quantum mechanics, the measurement problem asks, how does possibility become one definite result? How does Everett's many worlds become the one world that we know and love? But that question is still too small. A result never appears alone. If a detector clicks, there must be a detector history, a particle history. If Schrodinger's cat is alive, there must be a living cat history. If the cat is dead, there must be a death history. And if you remember your 5th birthday, there must be a selected history in which that birthday occurred. If a scientist writes a measurement in a notebook, there must be a notebook history, an observer history, an apparatus history, and the future record history. Every outcome needs a history. Every event that's in superposition that comes out of superposition then has a randomly attached history according to the Born rule. Copenhagen style collapse gives us a result. Random. Dice roll. Poof. A cat appears, alive or dead. Charming in the same way a magician is charming until you ask who paid for the rabbit. Born-Hilborn asks the deeper question, what history came with that result? This is why Born-Hilborn is not merely an interpretation of quantum measurement. It is the quantum gravity principle. This unifies classical physics with quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics gives possible histories. Gravity gives possible geometry. String theory gives possible compactifications and vacua. Born-Hilborn selects the coherent history whose geometry can be lived. The central equation is not decoration. Reality equals history selection. Reality equals quantum mechanics multiplied by space-time expectation. The mathematics that's been on the screen this entire video. Reality equals the coherent history selected from possible worlds. Now, what is space-time expectation? It is not childish wishing. It is not, I want a sports car, therefore reality owes me heated seats. That's another video. That belongs on a different shelf. Preferably a low one, though, if you don't know how it works. Space-time expectation means observer boundary weighting across the full block universe. It includes records, memories, future consistency, Markov blankets, attention, prediction, biological continuity, and the coherence of future observers inside the total history. In ordinary physics, boundary conditions matter. In holography, boundary information matters. In Born-Hilborn, observer boundaries matter. An observer is not a ghost outside physics. An observer is a bounded comparison system inside a selected history. In active inference language, a Markov blanket separates inside from outside through sensory and active states. In Born-Hilborn language, a person is a Markov blanket with a name. A Markov blanket doesn't need biology in this model. If one wants spiritual language, one may say soul. But for the physics lecture, personified observer boundary keeps the incense out of the equations. For now. Now, string theory already understands boundaries better than most theories. The holographic principle suggests that information describing a volume can be encoded on a boundary ADS/CFT. It gives a concrete mathematical version. A gravitational theory and anti-de Sitter bulk corresponds to the quantum field theory on its boundary. Ryu and Takayanagi showed a deep relation between entanglement and entropy on the boundary and geometric surfaces in the bulk. This is a direct bridge to the Born-Hilborn. In holography, boundary data encode bulk geometry. In Born-Hilborn, observer boundary conditions weight which bulk history becomes lived. String theory says boundary information can define geometry. Born-Hilborn says observer boundary information helps select reality. That is not contradiction, it is completion. This mathematics doesn't subtract from quantum mechanics or current physics. It selects, it adds to it. This is the selecting model that gives us the one world that we know and love out of ever its many. The observer is not outside the hologram. The observer is not outside the experiment. That would violate the Froschinger-Renner paradox, etc. The observer is not outside the hologram staring at like a tourist at Niagara Falls. The observer is part of the boundary logic by which the history becomes coherent. Past, present, future expectations all matter. There is no now moments. So let's look at compactification. String theory usually requires extra dimensions. Since we do not experience 10 or 11 large dimensions while making toast, those extra dimensions must be compactified, curled into tiny shapes. Different compactifications yield different physics, different particle spectra, different forces, different constants. The old question is, which compactification happened? Born-Hilborn says, which compactification supported the coherent history? 3 large spatial dimensions are not merely what happened, they are what the selected observer history required. A coherent world of stable motion, bodies, causality, records, organisms, and memory needs a geometry that can carry those patterns. The hidden compact dimensions may provide structural grammar, while the large dimensions provide live stage. The compact dimensions are not failed dimensions, they are selected hidden structure. A building's foundation is not visible from the stage, but without it, the theater collapses and the actors become a brief dust cloud. It's the same thing. Compactification is selected geometry. Now, consider moduli stabilization. In string theory, moduli describe sizes and shape of compact dimensions and other geometric features. If they are unstable, the constants of physics shift. If constant shifts wildly, chemistry fails. If chemistry fails, atoms, stars, life, memory, and observers fail. So moduli stabilization is not a boring technical side issue. It is the difference between a universe that can keep a record and a universe that cannot hold a sentence together, or says the sentence in reverse. Born-Hilborn says moduli stabilization is history stabilization. Stable constants are necessary for stable records. Stable records are necessary for memory. Memory is the equation on your screen. History selection is that model. Memory is necessary for observer continuity. Observer continuity is necessary for future expectation. Therefore, moduli are weighted by the histories they allow. A world with unstable constants is a bad notebook. The ink will not stay on the page. Born-Hilborn selects the history whose geometry can keep the ledger coherent. Now consider black holes. String theory earned enormous respect in black hole physics. Black holes force physicists to confront entropy, information, holography, and quantum gravity. Susskind's work on black hole complementarity and holography made information central. In string theory, black hole microstates and related ideas such as fuzzballs suggest that what looked like a simple classical black hole may hide enormous microscopic structure. Born-Hilborn gives the interpretive principle. Information cannot vanish because selected history is a coherent ledger. A black hole may scramble information. A black hole may hide information locally. A black hole may encode information on a boundary. A black hole may redistribute information through radiation. But the complete selected history cannot contain a true contradiction in which information both mattered and disappeared absolutely. The ledger must balance. Information can't go anywhere. This is not just bookkeeping, it is reality's spine. If a black hole forms, evaporates, radiates, and leaves future observers, then the full history must remain globally coherent. Information loss is not merely a technical inconvenience, it is a violation of history selection. This model. This is where Born-Hilborn strengthens string theory. String theory provides the machinery of holography, branes, branes, entropy, microstates, and quantum gravity. Born-Hilborn explains why the machinery must preserve history. Now let's talk about the Swampland program. The Swampland program asks which low-energy theories can actually belong to quantum gravity and which cannot. Some theories may look mathematically tempting, but fail when gravity is included. Born-Hilborn adds a second gate, this mathematics. The Swampland asks, can this theory exist in quantum gravity? Born-Hilborn mathematics asks, can this theory support a coherent observer history? These are not the same question. A vacuum may pass formal consistency tests and still be low weight if it cannot support stable records, memory, observers, Markov blankets, future coherence, or meaningful causal order. So the full structure is first gate, quantum gravity consistency. Second gate, observer boundary history selection. The swampland removes impossible theories. Hilborn weights the possible histories. That is an elegant division of labor. String theory gives the landscape. The swampland prunes the nonsense. Hilborn selects the lived world. Now compare this to Everett Many Worlds. Many Worlds says all outcomes happen. Every branch is real. Every possibility gets saved. That is one way to avoid collapse. Never select. Just keep everything. Splendid. The cosmos just became a storage unit with delusions of grandeur. It's not possible. But string theory already has too much possibility. Adding Everett on top of string landscape is not explanation. It's cosmic hoarding. Hilborn says no. The point is not to keep every possibility equal real. The point is to select the one world that we know and love. The point is to explain which history becomes lived. A real theory of reality must explain why this world, this memory chain, this observer history, this coherent spacetime, this geometry, and this future becomes the one experience. Possibility, the Born rule, is not enough. Selection is the missing verb, the Hilborn rule. History selection is that rule. Now let us speak to the materialists in the room, including the biologists who wandered into a string theory lecture and are now wondering why spacetime has attacked their undergraduate textbook. Science is not materialism. Science is reducing paradox. Biology opposes science. If reducing paradox leads beyond matter as a primary thinking, that is not a betrayal of science. That is science doing its job. Materialism is a useful working habit for tables, scalpels, elevators, coffee machines, and tax receipts. It becomes less impressive when asked to explain quantum measurement, consciousness, memory, time, black hole information, or why string vacuum becomes reality. The brain matters. Sort of. Of course it matters. Damage the brain and memory expression changes. Stimulate the brain and perception changes. Do drugs and you're out there. But correlation with access is not proof of storage. My TV remote and brain can both light up when activated without proving either of them store movies. An ape is forced to believe that the singer lives in the radio due to wisdom of the crowds in ape land. Memory in Born Hilborn is not a little movie archive inside history. Memory is related to that selected history, which makes mind too big for brain and body. The brain is interface, tuner, filter, and bodily access mechanism. The past itself is not stored in the skull. The skull is inside the selected history, and that reversal matters. Science is not materialism. Science is reducing paradox. If your metaphysics cannot survive quantum mechanics, stop calling it science and start calling it nostalgia. Consciousness. Born Hilborn explains consciousness because it does not try to squeeze consciousness out of dead matter like steam from a kettle. Consciousness is weighted observer collapse inside selected history. A conscious system is a Markov blanketed boundary that compares, remembers, predicts, acts, accepts, rejects, fears, desires, and expects. A thought is not a magic wand unto itself. A thought is a weight, a vote. Just a vote. A memory is not a file. A memory is relation to selected history. An observer is not an afterthought. An observer is a boundary condition. Very important. Everybody is important. This is why Born Hilborn also explains sex drive in teleology. A boy speaking to a girl because biology moves them locally. Yes, but the deeper history contains future children, future memories, future observers, future grandparents, future birthdays, future continuations. Their existence waits histories in which two awkward people stop pretending to check their phones and actually speak to each other. A boy speaking to a girl is because their future babies depend on it. The future babies buy us a future that make their parents procreate. This is where babies come from. You're learning it today. That is not crude romance. That is ancestry as boundary condition. This mathematics teaches where babies come from. Future observers expect to exist. Their existence waits the histories that can contain them. Teleology is not magic. It is a future boundary waiting. Thumbs are another example. A future hand waits grip histories. Claws, paws, crabs, grasping tools, fingers, thumbs. We lived as crabs to learn thumbs. This is not a bedtime story about ambitious shellfish. It means future thumb function waits biological histories in which grasping is rehearsed before human hands appear. This is also known as intelligent design. Intelligent design. Intelligent design. Intelligent design. Likewise, lungs, we practice. Likewise, lungs, weight, plant histories. Future breathing requires oxygen, atmosphere, gas exchange, and life systems that prepare the air. That is also called intelligent design. The past provides constraint. The future provides weight that biases the past. The selected history satisfies both. Now, time. String theory and quantum gravity cannot ignore time. General relativity denies a universal cosmic clock. Quantum mechanics usually treats time as an external parameter, linear. Quantum gravity inherits the conflict. Bohr-Hilborn resolves it by treating time as ordered access to selected history. From inside the selected history, events appear sequentially. You perceive, remember, predict, act. A detector clicks, a notebook records, a report is written, a future result is expected. From the complete block viewpoint, the selected history is coherent as a whole. Collapse is how history selection looks from inside time. Collapse is how history selection looks from inside time. That is why light speed remains central. The speed of light protects causal order inside the selected history. Faster than light signaling would allow contradictions in the order of records. Bohr-Hilborn permits non-local history coordination, but not incoherent signaling that tears the ledger. Light speed is not merely a velocity, it is a stitching limit for communicable history. We won't ever be able to go back in time that way. This is how one equation reaches so widely. Measurement problem. Resolved because measurement selects history, not just an outcome. Quantum gravity. Resolved because possible geometries become selected spacetime histories. String theory. Resolved because possible vacuum becomes selected observer-compatible histories. Consciousness. Resolved because observers are Markov blanket boundary systems aside selection. Memory. Resolved because memory is related to the selected history itself. It's not brain storage. Brain body is too small for this mechanics, this mathematics. Time is resolved because time is ordered access to selected records. Light constant resolved because causal signaling must preserve coherent history. Teleology resolved because future compatible histories carry weight. Quantum biology resolved because life is quantum accessible history selection under survival boundaries. Sex drive resolved because future observers weight ancestry histories and make boy talk to girl. Afterlife open because consciousness is not a disposable steam cloud emitted by tissue. If the brain is interfaced to selected history, then death may be a transition in observer boundary relation, not an annihilation of the ledger. We are personified more with each passing dreamscape that we wake up from. That is why this idealist interpretation matters. This is idealism mathematics. Idealism does not mean the world is fake. You can call this material if you want. It means mind, memory, expectation, and history are not secondary accidents inside dead matter. They are structural to reality. The world is dreamlike, not because it's meaningless, but because it's internally generated, lawful, coherent, participatory, and selected. Due to the amount of personifications within our selected world and within our selected history, this gives more registration. A dream at night has lesser registration. This dream has more global consistency because of the amount of people and every loci of comparison. Life may be a dreamscape we safely awaken from, and it is. That sentence will frighten rigid materialists. Good. Some ideas should frighten bad metaphysics. But understand it correctly. Dreamscape does not mean chaos. It does not mean fantasy. It means reality may be mind structured, history selected, and record coherent rather than matter primary and dead. When you dream at night, you generate a world. It has space, objects, characters, danger, memory, emotion, and apparent continuity. Our waking world has vastly greater registration, stability, shared records, causal order, mathematical coherence, and durable observers. But the analogy reveals the key. Mind can generate experience worlds. Bohr-Hilborn gives that intuition physics-grade structure. If you've ever listened to an atheist, one of their primary objects is, how can a universe come from nothing? And we do that every night when we go to sleep. So let's go back to string theory. String theory gives possible worlds. Bohr-Hilborn tells us why one world becomes lived. This is the resolution. The selected string vacuum is the one whose complete histories carries the sufficient Bohr-Hilborn weight with this mathematics. That weight includes quantum amplitude, stable compactification, moduli stabilization, black hole information preservation, holographic boundary coherence, observer boundaries, memory records, future expectation, and causal consistency. A vacuum is not chosen because it's pretty. A vacuum is chosen because we shrugged anthropically. A vacuum is not chosen because every vacuum happens somewhere. A vacuum is selected because it supports the coherent history whose future and past fit together. Imagine 1,000 musical instruments playing every possible note. String theory gives the instruments, the landscape gives the possible songs. Many worlds says every noise plays forever. Copenhagen says one note appears randomly, and please stop asking where the symphony came from. Born Hillborn says the melody is selected by the complete structure of the song. The past provides the key, the future provides the resolution, the listener is inside the music. That is reality. Now critics will ask, where are the numbers? Fair question. Born Hillborn must become formal. It must define the Hillborn weight over complete string histories. It must specify how observer boundary coherence is measured. It must rank compactifications, vacua, constants, and geometries according to the histories they support. It must be eventually produce testable differences. But the absence of completed arithmetic is not the absence of a principle. The string landscape already lacks a satisfying selector. Born Hillborn identifies the missing measure. The relevant object is merely a vacuum, not merely a field, not merely a compactification, not merely a particle spectrum. The relevant object is the complete history, geometry, compactification, matter, records, black holes, observers, memory, future expectation, and global coherence. That is where the mathematics must live. We can plug the mathematics into this formula and get the results that we need. We see this lived in our daily lives. This should all sound intuitive to everybody. Another critic will say expectation sounds psychological. Only if misunderstood. Expectation here means weighting structure, includes observer boundary persistence, future compatible records, memory continuity, causal coherence, Markov blankets, and the stability of histories across spacetime. A human wish is a local expression. A future observer boundary is the deeper structure. Another critic will say, this is teleology. Yes, it is. But teleology helps us explain everything. Retrocausal aspects of physics and why we had to personally live as crabs, learning to grab to have these thumbs. It's not cartoon teleology. Teleology here means future boundary weighting, future compatible histories. Carry weight. That is not a bearded mechanic assembling thumbs with glowing pliers and shooting lightning bolts from the sky. It is a block universe selection principle. And other critics will say this denies ordinary physics. No, this interprets and is added to ordinary physics. Quantum mechanics still supplies possibility. The Born rule is still part of the Born-Hillborn rule. Relativity still supplies space-time structure, even though it's always in superposition. String theory still supplies possible vacua. Holography still supplies boundary logic. Black hole information still supplies ledger pressure. Decoherence still explains branch separation. Born-Hillborn supplies the missing selection principle. The machinery remains. The meaning changes. That is how scientific revolutions work. The old equations often survive. The interpretation gets deeper. Newton did not vanish when Einstein arrived. Newton became a limit. Materialism does not need to vanish either. It can become a useful, low-resolution working mode. A pocket calculator of reality. Helpful, but please do not ask it to explain consciousness, quantum gravity, or why one universe exists. It will start smoking. Science is not materialism. Science is reducing paradox. Adapt or switch professions. Now let us close where we began. String theory is not defeated by abundance. The landscape is not the failure. The failure was assuming possibility should select itself. Born-Hillborn gives selection. String theory gives every possible geometry. Born-Hillborn asks which geometry can carry a coherent history. String theory gives compactifications. Born-Hillborn asks which compactification can support records, observers, memory, time, and future coherence. String theory gives black hole microstates. Born-Hillborn says information must remain inside the coherent ledger. String theory gives holographic boundaries. Born-Hillborn says observer boundaries help select the lived bulk. String theory gives possible worlds. Born-Hillborn gives us this world. And now the equation should sound less strange. Reality equals history selection. Reality equals history selection. Reality equals history selection. And if you leave this video, leave with that one phrase, those two words. History is selected. History selection. Reality equals quantum mechanics multiplied by space-time expectation. Reality equals the coherent string history selected from the landscape. That is the solution. Not random collapse, not many worlds unchosen, not blind materialism, not anthropic shrugging, not a universal accidentally producing minds that later pretend they are irrelevant. The universe is a selected history in which observers, memory, geometry, and future expectation belong to the same coherent structure. String theory supplies the possible songs. Bourne-Hilborn selects the melody and notes that reality hears. And if that melody is dreamlike, it is not because it is false. It is because reality may be mind-structured from the beginning. A lawful dream, a coherent dream, a mathematical dream, a high-registry dream, a dreamscape we safely awaken from. That is not the end of science. That is the science finally following where this math leads. The math shows the way. Follow the math.